Hello and welcome to Cellular Respiration Explained. Alright, so cellular respiration. What is cellular respiration? It is a process that releases energy as ATP by the process of breaking down glucose molecules in the presence of oxygen, or you could do anaerobic, which doesn't have oxygen. Now, if we look at this equation, we can tell that the stuff used in the first stage to make the second stage, the reactants and the products, are swapped from photosynthesis. So in the photosynthesis equation, you would see 6CO2 plus 6H2O is used to produce this, like this. All right, next, the cellular respiration formula. Yeah, this is just showing how the products and reactants are switched with each other. All right, so cellular respiration overview. So there's two kinds, aerobic and anaerobic. So we're going to start with aerobic. So the first step of aerobic is actually an anaerobic step, which is kind of confusing, but you'll see why later. So glycolysis is when the glucose splits into two pyruvate, and pyruvate are basically like half glucoses. So if you know the chemical formula of glucose, it's like that. Well, you just turn that into half and divide it into two pyruvates, which would be half of each one. It occurs in the cytoplasm and produces 2 ATP. All right, next, the Krebs cycle. So the Krebs cycle is technically anaerobic, however, it does require oxygen for some parts, just not in the same way. Thus, it's considered an aerobic step. So the Krebs cycle also produces 2 ATP. Pyruvate enters the mitochondria and it produces 2 ATP and the electron carriers, which will basically help move the electrons through the next step, which is the electron transport chain. So the electron transport chain is the final aerobic step and is basically your main producer of things. So the electron transport chain kind of moves electrons up and down, producing energy, which is obviously ATP. So the electron transport chain produces water and 32 ATP. Like I said, it's the main producer. So what you can tell with this is that glycolysis, which is the only anaerobic step, only produces 2 ATP, meaning in the lack of oxygen, you cannot undergo these two steps. So in anaerobic cellular respiration, you can only undergo glycolysis, so you would only have 2 ATP produced. However, if you have the full electron transport chain with all the aerobic stuff, you would produce 32 ATP from the electron transport chain, 2 from the Krebs cycle, and 2 from glycolysis. However, I don't want you to think of this as like an exact number, 36. Just think of it as more of a range because the scientists are still like determining like the exact causes in between stuff, and there's a bunch of variable factors. Think of like 30 to 38, somewhere around that range. All right. Anaerobic. So, anaerobic is divided into alcohol fermentation and lactic acid fermentation. So, releasing energy from food producing ATP without oxygen, like I mentioned earlier, and only produces 2 ATP total, like I mentioned earlier. So, alcohol fermentation produces ethyl alcohol and carbon dioxide and is mainly used in yeast and bacteria. It isn't really relevant to the human process, which is what we're going to look at today. All right. So, next is lactic acid fermentation. So, lactic acid fermentation occurs in your muscles, bacteria, and some plants. And so, what lactic acid is basically like a substance that will like it's what makes your muscles sore pretty much. Like if you constantly move muscle over and over again in the same way, you will produce some lactic acid, which will like kind of like jam it up and make it like hurt to move. All right. So the cell's usable source of energy is ATP, but what exactly is ATP? Well, ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, which is obviously because there's three phosphate groups. There's the ribose and there's the adenine. So from this, you might notice that is extremely similar to what a nucleic acid looks like, and that would be correct. ATP is actually a type of nucleic acid. All right, next, ADP. So ADP is used whenever that one extra phosphate atom, which would be right here, when it's used. So basically, your body has ATP, and it turns it into ADP, And then after that, it it restores basically the energy in the ADP and turns it back into ATP. So it's kind of like a cycle, which we'll look at more in homeostasis. So all energy is stored in the bonds of compounds. So, like I said, the phosphorus bonds, these store energy pretty much. You can look at it as a battery, like this analogy here, but I think I found like a wire more helpful. Like it's like a wire transferring electricity, and whenever there's only two, you don't have enough to transfer. However, whenever you add the third one, it kind of like restores the whole system. But most people find the partially charged battery analogy more helpful. So ADP would be like a partially charged battery, and then ATP would be a fully charged battery because it has all the necessary stuff. All right. So next we're going to compare photosynthesis and respiration. So photosynthesis occurs in producer and it occurs in the chloroplast, which obviously we do not possess. And cellular respiration occurs in all organisms. That is definitely going to be like a trick question if you're going to have a test on this. So cellular respiration occurs in plants and in animals. But where do animals get their ingredients from? Well, we know plants undergo photosynthesis, which produces all of this stuff, so they can just self recycle these necessary ingredients for cellular respiration. However, animals like us, we have to use the stuff released by plants in order to undergo cellular respiration because we do not undergo photosynthesis. And that is it for cellular respiration explained. I hope you have a basic understanding of it now and can pursue more advanced studies.